Do you know that black men were sexually exploited by white women during the slave trade? It's a truth so disturbing that history tried to bury it. Enslaved black men weren't just whipped and worked to death. They were forced into silent, sickening submission. White women, often seen as fragile and pure, used their power to dominate, humiliate, and sexually abuse black male slaves in ways too cruel to imagine. These men had no choice, no voice, no protection. Their bodies were stolen, their pain erased. This is the brutal, hidden horror of slavery that no one talks about. Until now. Before we continue, kindly subscribe to my channel, like this video, and drop your thoughts in the comments section below. The abuse of black male slaves by white women. For a long time, the stories of enslaved black men have been told through a narrow lens, one that often ignores the disturbing realities of their suffering, especially at the hands of white women. Historians and scholars are beginning to re-examine these buried truths, shedding light on a chapter of history that many have avoided. Traditionally, people believed that only men, particularly white men, held power in slave societies. Women were seen as too emotionally fragile, physically weak, or morally upright to commit acts of violence or sexual abuse. But the truth is more complex and uncomfortable. Many white women were not passive bystanders in the slave system. They were active participants. They owned, abused, and dominated enslaved people, including black men. And they did so not only with legal and social support, but also with personal conviction. Some white women used their position to satisfy twisted fantasies of control, power, and sexual domination. This story is rarely told. Sexual power and the abuse of black men. Most people associate sexual abuse in slavery with black women as victims and white men as perpetrators. That did happen frequently. But we cannot forget the enslaved men who were also victims of sexual exploitation, especially by white women who owned them or had access to them. A major reason this form of abuse has been ignored is because society has long clung to the idea that men cannot be raped, especially by women. This belief is rooted in dangerous gender stereotypes, that men always want sex, that women are too delicate to be predators, and that rape is only about violent physical force. But rape is about power, and power, in slave societies, often came with whiteness and freedom, not just gender. Historian Thomas Foster writes that black male slaves were subjected to different forms of sexual violence, from forced penetration to coerced reproduction, manipulation, humiliation, and emotional control. These men were powerless to refuse or resist. Documented examples of abuse. The evidence is chilling. In one case, a man named Lewis Bourne filed for divorce in 1824, accusing his white wife of having a long-standing sexual relationship with a black male slave named Edmund. She didn't just have an affair, she continued to pursue Edmund, exerting control over him as property while defying the racial and gender norms of her society. Harriet Jacobs, a formerly enslaved woman who escaped and later wrote an autobiography in 1861, tells the disturbing story of a male slave named Luke. He was kept chained beside his sick master's bed. His only purpose was to serve the man's physical needs, including sexual ones. Jacobs used careful, indirect language to avoid offending readers of her time, but the implications were clear. Luke was treated not as a human, but as a body to be used, punished, and broken. White travelers in the South during the 1800s also documented stories of white women seducing enslaved men. In Virginia, one planter's daughter was said to have fallen in love with one of her father's slaves, seducing him despite the enormous power imbalance between them. The American Freedmen's Inquiry Commission, created during the Civil War to gather testimonies from former slaves and abolitionists, collected several stories of sexual abuse by white women. Captain Richard Hinton, an abolitionist, claimed he had never spoken to a bright-looking colored man who hadn't been forced to have sex with a white woman at some point. One former slave told him that after her husband died, his mistress ordered him into her bed. These were not rare, isolated events. They were symptoms of a broader pattern of dominance. Light-skinned slaves as targets. Just as light-skinned enslaved women were often targeted for sexual exploitation due to their appearance, so were light-skinned enslaved men. White women were known to be particularly attracted to these men and often saw them not as people, but as objects of desire and domination. Their lighter skin made them seem more desirable and less other, while still marking them as inferior and enslaved. Perfect targets for women who wanted to exert power without fear of social consequences. White women as slaveholders. Another myth that needs to be dismantled is that white women were only victims of the patriarchal system and had no real power in slaveholding America. That couldn't be further from the truth. When George Washington married Martha in 1759, he brought around 18 enslaved people to their home. Martha brought 84. That's right, Martha Washington, often remembered as a first lady and gentle figure of early American life, was a significant slaveholder in her own right. According to historian Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, white women made up around 40% of all slaveholders in parts of the South, based on 1850 and 1860 census records. In fact, enslaved people were often passed down to daughters rather than sons because they were seen as more practical than land for young women. Owning more enslaved people made a woman more attractive for marriage. White women didn't just own enslaved people. They actively bought, sold, and managed them. They placed newspaper ads searching for runaway slaves, hired bounty hunters to retrieve them, and even went to court to retain ownership after marriage. Many won these cases. Slavery wasn't just part of their husband's wealth. It was their wealth, and they knew it. Many white women were groomed for this role from a young age. As little girls, they were given enslaved people as gifts, trained to beat them, and taught that controlling black bodies was their right. According to testimonies from formerly enslaved people collected in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration, WPA, white children were often encouraged to punish enslaved people, even if the children were tiny and the slaves were adults. One woman said she was beaten so badly by a white child that blood ran down her body. The cruelty wasn't a secret. It was a lesson. White women often forced black women to serve as wet nurses for their babies, tearing them away from their own newborns in the process. They placed thousands of ads seeking enslaved women who had recently given birth, creating a cruel market based on the ability to produce milk. One white woman wrote that she didn't want to breastfeed because it made her feel like a slave to her children. So she made another woman, already enslaved, do it instead. In some cases, formerly enslaved people said that white women even timed their own pregnancies to match the pregnancies of black women, ensuring they'd have a wet nurse available after giving birth. In some cases, they arranged for sexual violence between enslaved men and women, hoping to breed more laborers. Even after slavery was abolished, many white women didn't give up their desire for domination. During the Civil War, as Union soldiers approached, some women moved enslaved people farther away to avoid losing them. One woman, Martha Gibbs, even relocated enslaved people to Texas and held them at gunpoint, forcing them to work until 1866, a full year after slavery was outlawed. When the war ended, many white women found ways to re-establish control through work contracts, exploiting the formerly enslaved and ensuring that the system of racial domination continued. Some, like Margaret Mitchell, even wrote nostalgic books like Gone with the Wind, romanticizing slavery and portraying it as a time of peace and gentle order. But the truth is much darker. Why these stories were hidden? Most historical narratives have focused on white male slaveholders as the main villains of slavery, while white women were cast as helpless bystanders. This was deliberate. Stories of white women abusing enslaved people, especially black men, challenge the idea of the pure, virtuous Southern lady. Black men were not believed when they spoke about their abuse. Their pain was dismissed, and their stories were excluded from the history books. Speaking out often meant death, punishment, or more violence for themselves or their loved ones. So many stayed silent. But not all. Some survivors did tell their stories, and historians today are working to find and preserve these rare accounts. These testimonies reveal a hidden reality: that white women were not only capable of cruelty, but in many cases, they were eager participants in a system that granted them godlike control over the lives of others. The abuse of black male slaves by white women is not just a footnote in history. It is a crucial part of understanding how race, gender, and power operated under slavery. These stories must be told, no matter how uncomfortable they are, because real justice begins with truth. By remembering these forgotten victims and exposing the roles white women played in their suffering, we take a step toward healing, inclusion, and accountability. For the enslaved black men who survived this kind of abuse, the pain didn't end with freedom. In fact, many carried that trauma to their graves, never speaking of it, never being believed when they tried. Most didn't even have the language to describe what had been done to them. How could they? Society didn't acknowledge their pain. If a black man confessed that he had been sexually abused by a white woman, he risked being laughed at, or worse, lynched. Black masculinity was already feared and demonized. To admit victimhood was to challenge that image, and it left many men vulnerable to humiliation, disbelief, and even violence. So they stayed silent. Some developed intense shame. Others grew angry and withdrawn. Many passed on their pain without realizing it, through fear, mistrust, or emotional distance. These effects trickled into future generations. Sons learned not to cry. Fathers refused to talk about the past. Grandsons inherited the weight of secrets that had no name. This generational trauma still exists. You can feel it in the silence surrounding certain topics in black families. You can see it in the way many black men are expected to be strong, always in control, never broken. But behind that silence are centuries of pain that were never treated, never acknowledged. In the antebellum South, male slave owners used sexual assault as a deliberate tool to dominate, dehumanize, and emasculate enslaved black men. While the brutal oppression and violence of chattel slavery are well documented, along with the sexual abuse frequently inflicted upon female slaves, the suffering endured by male slaves through sexual violence has often been overlooked or ignored. This discussion does not seek to diminish the immense trauma experienced by enslaved women, but rather to highlight that sexual assault was also systematically used against male slaves as a method of control and punishment. Common belief holds that only women were victims of such violently predatory acts by slaveholders, yet a deeper examination of the narratives of Olaudah Equiano, Harriet Jacobs, and Frederick Douglass reveals that male slaves faced comparable abuses. Ultimately, these acts of cruelty were part of a broader system aimed at maximizing American wealth by exploiting the forced labor of an entire people. Some people might ask, why talk about this now? Slavery is over. Isn't it time to move on? The answer is simple. We can't heal what we don't acknowledge. These aren't just historical facts. They are the roots of today's racial, emotional, and gender-based injustices. Understanding how white women participated in slavery and how they harmed both black men and women challenges us to rethink everything we were taught about power, race, and victimhood. It reminds us that evil doesn't always look like a man with a whip. Sometimes, it looks like a lady in a lace dress, holding a Bible in one hand and a slave's fate in the other. When we erase the stories of black male victims, we deny them justice. When we ignore the violence white women committed, we leave out half the truth. Real history is not clean. It's not polite. And it's not always comfortable. But it is necessary. Today, a growing number of black scholars, Writers and activists are reclaiming these hidden stories. They are digging into dusty archives, analyzing coded testimonies, and piecing together the truth from the edges of documents left behind. They're doing this not out of anger, but out of love, for justice, for truth, and for the dignity of those whose voices were stolen. Books like They Were Her Property by Dr. Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers reveal just how deeply white women were involved in the economic and emotional violence of slavery. These works are not just academic. They are acts of remembrance, of healing, and of defiance. Because the world may have tried to silence black male victims of white female abusers, but their stories are still here. And they matter. Imagine being a young black man, chained, stripped of your name, and treated as a thing. Then imagine being forced, night after night, to share a bed with someone who owned you, someone who whispered your name like a secret but screamed at you like property. Now imagine that person being remembered by history as a proper lady. Her sins erased because she wore pearls and had pale skin. That is what happened, and it happened to thousands. So the next time someone tells you that slavery was long ago, or that it wasn't that bad, remember this: slavery didn't just break bodies, it shattered spirits. And part of rebuilding that humanity starts with telling the truth, even the ugliest, most hidden parts of it. What you've heard today is not fiction, it's history. A history drenched in pain, silence, and forgotten cries. The abuse of black male slaves by white women has long been ignored, erased from books, and softened by lies. But the truth matters. Their stories matter. We must remember, not to reopen old wounds, but to honor those who suffered in silence and to ensure history never repeats itself. If this video moved you, please show your support. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with others.